Good morning. I'm Tami Sawyer. I consider myself a native Memphian. Been here most of my life. Graduated from St. Mary's Episcopal School in 2000, University of Memphis in 2004. After that, I spent 10 years in D.C. I left to go to Howard University School of Law. While in D.C., I realized that I was not a law student, and so ended up working for the United States Navy as a diversity practitioner and human capital analyst. During that time, I did side jobs like most millennials, had a cupcake business, Tami Cakes, a quick spin on Food Network, Cupcake Wars was a fun point in my life. A little trivia for you. And in 2013, I moved home. There were a couple of things. One, I just was seeking what was next in life, and professionally and personally. And I had been following the Choose 901 blog from home and from DC, and I was like, oh, there's so much happening in Memphis, you know, like things that I was used to going to in DC were popping up in Memphis, and it just seemed like, you know, space was being made for millennials to return home. And I was really excited about that, and just connecting with a lot of Memphians on social media, especially through Twitter, and just following what was going on. And I was like, gosh, there's just a lot of development, and it just seems like a lot of progress and change. It's time to go home. Then there was a shooting at the Navy Yard while I was working there, and that propelled me to really make that decision much quicker. Also, I consider 2013 to be like a great awakening of my generation, when Trayvon Martin was killed. And at the time, it really caused me to pause and think about what was I doing, what was I contributing to society and to change, and to end the racial oppression that I saw continuing to exist. When I returned home, I bounced around a bit, just still worked for Navy while looking for work here. And it was really hard to find a job, even with almost 7 years of professional work for the government. It was hard to really translate that work into either, you know, something that people understood. Folks would be like, what's this acronym mean? And I'd be like, oh, it's just a ship, you know, or, you know, something like that. And I started to realize that this golden age of millennialism was not really open to everyone, or accessible to everyone. And so just being a part of, you know, living in Memphis, returning home to Memphis, I did not feel chosen for 901 originally. And I ended up working at the school board and got a job there, still more human capital work, new teacher orientation, licensure, things like that. And at the same time, Mike Brown was murdered, and then Eric Garner was murdered. And a lot of response was happening across the country, but I just didn't see that happening here. Whereas when I was driving around Memphis, I would just see such stark inequity. You know, you cross a street and things change very rapidly. And the more I worked in the school system, the more I saw how underserved, especially kids of color, were. And so that just really led me into the work that I began to do as an organizer. At first it became out of passion. The first thing that I ever planned was a response to the officer who shot Eric Garner not being indicted at the Civil Rights Museum. And then from there I just kept working, writing, reading, learning, speaking, organizing, to the point where we are today. Working on Darius Stewart, Take Him Down 901. I'm now with Teach for America. I'm the Managing Director of Diversity and Community Partnerships. And in that work, I work to disrupt things such as school-to-prison pipeline by teaching our teachers about implicit bias, oppression, restorative response shifts, reflexive justice, you know, things like that, cultural competence.
You're the Democratic nominee for Shelby County District 7. Why do you want to be a Shelby County Commissioner?
Yeah, so for me, this is my second race. I ran 2 years ago for the State House, and that race came because I was seeing a lot of the voting that was happening by my opponent at the time and wasn't happy with that. This race came because after I lost to Representative DeBerry, I just did a lot of evaluation. Was politics really the next move for me? Did I just want to stay on the ground? And the more that I read and studied about grassroots activism, believe strongly that the work continues into policy, that we have to work to disrupt policy from the inside and out. And in last year, 2017, we spent a lot of time, we being the grassroots community in Memphis, spent a lot of time at the county commission. Fund more, fund our kids more in education, public health, funding free condom distribution, making requests about, ensuring that the federal monitoring remained at the juvenile courts, and so on and so forth. And, the more I studied and read about the funding that the commission does and the oversight it has on education, public health, and even workforce development, that really spoke to my heart and to my work. And I just see it as an opportunity, and for us to redistribute our resources equitably and to end some of the systemic oppression that exists in Shelby County.
So how long have you lived in District 7? Where exactly is it, and what are some of the concerns of the folks in District 7?
Yep. District 7 is a pretty broad district. I've lived there since February 2015, I believe. So about 3 years, a little over 3.5 years now. And so it encompasses the northern half of Midtown, Valentine, Evergreen, the Chelsea Green Line. It includes New Chicago, Smoky City, Klondike. It goes into parts of Fraser. We cross the Wolf River over into parts of Fraser such as Scenic Hills and Sky Lake. It includes Hines Park. It includes the Heights all the way up to Highland and Binghamton as well.
And what are some of the concerns you're hearing from District 7?
Yeah, when we're out, we do a lot of canvassing. People are concerned about criminal justice, so they're concerned about safety, but they're also concerned about what responding to safety looks like for increased arrest in the community. So balancing reducing crime with increasing imprisonment of community members is something that comes up a lot. People are concerned about economic things, food deserts. There's very few grocery stores across District 7 once you pass a certain area. There's very little business ownership. There's few jobs. When I visited Carpenter Art Garden in Binghamton a few weeks ago, things that were coming up were education. They're feeling disconnected from the schools as the schools continue to combine and then bring in programs such as STEM. Kids such as East is attached to Binghamton, and so the concern was that the parents felt pushed out of a school that had been a community school for a really long time. Mm-hmm. And now their kids have to ride, our dilapidated bus system for hours to get to charter schools. And one mom told me her kid had been pushed out of East because of low grades when the STEM program started there. She had to send him to a charter school, and then that charter school closed this year, and now he'll have to go to another. And she's thinking about just putting him in Gateway to finish. And so education, and just like when we think about access to education, that intertwines with transportation, because when we consolidate schools, we're, limiting the walkability of kids to, get into school buildings. And that even when we look at the poverty levels impacts kids because, riding a bus is not free or, cheap to get there. And so those are the things that are really coming up. Education is big, safety is big, losing populations to mass incarceration comes up, very frequently. Whereas, again, people are just trying to figure out how to balance. We want to be safe, but we don't want our kids in jail. And we need jobs.
Speaking of jobs, Tami, because you already referenced the food deserts in your communities, as well as communities economically ravaged. But there's great development happening in Memphis, particularly downtown Memphis, looking every which way, midtown Memphis as well, and particularly out east. How do you use some of the developmental tools that the Commission has at its disposal that we use here, from EDGE to pilots and other things like that, to try and restart and resuscitate development in areas like yours?
Yeah. So I've been calling my idea the Broad Avenue model. One thing that I really like is Broad Avenue is in the district, and Broad Avenue was able to redevelop with the tools mentioned, EDGE, pilots, TIFs. But there's a lot of women ownership on Broad Avenue, and they have done a relatively insightful job of staying connected to the community around it. A lot of kids from Binghamton, come over, and when you do the art walks, they are part of those events and things like that. What I see possible is creating hyper-local business communities. You could have a Broad Avenue in New Chicago or Smoky City. In the Heights, National Street could become another Broad Avenue where we educate community members on what it looks like to be a part of a business development program, like the program they have going on in the medical district for new developers, what it looks like, what an EDGE program is, what pilots are, what TIFs are, so that they're able to use those resources to get funding for their small business ideas. Because I think instead of relying on one or two developers to come through and develop all of Memphis, will be so much powerful and really embrace the vast diversity of our city if we empower people to become small business owners and develop business districts in their neighborhoods. And then I think you'll begin to see that spread into smaller grocery stores opening, but healthy grocery stores, not like corner stores, We'll see the businesses match the care and concern. We won't be opening hair shops and liquor stores. We'll be opening things that the community really needs, and that it will just be so much richer. You go to cities that look like ours, and you can find Little Ethiopia in DC and Chinatown in Chicago, and just places that really, you go to Harlem in New York, and it still, reflects the business ownership of the Black community. And so, it'd be great for us to figure out how to have our communities reflect the identities of the people who live there, instead of having just vast development that washes that away. So as if I were a commissioner, the way to implement that, I think that there needs to be more programming to ensure that people understand these tools and the ways that they are available to them, and looking at the transportation and access concerns, bringing them to communities. Because it's not that people don't have ideas, and it's not that people don't want to develop their communities. It's the access to, one, understanding what's out there for them, two, being connected with the people and programs they need to be able to do that.
You've worked for TFA for a while. You were educated at St. Mary's, and you're going to be, if you are on the county commission, you're going to be sort of supervising Shelby County schools.
Right.
So you're very familiar with the education landscape in Memphis. I wonder if you could talk just a bit about that. I mean, there's already was a lot of mobility, especially among lower income kids in the city and county. Now there seems to be even more, because schools are closing, charters are opening and closing. Right. There's lots of districts redrawing. How do you feel about the way things are in public education in Memphis, and what would you hope to do as a Shelby County Commissioner? Yeah.
So I think that we're in a in-between state with education in Memphis. It's not, I wouldn't give it a 0, I wouldn't give it a 10. We're somewhere in between. We're spiking on some things, and others we have a lot of work on. One of my highest concerns is that mobility of students is the closure of neighborhood schools. You know, I'm happy that it was frozen for a while, but I'm concerned if it starts back up. You know, the more we consolidate schools, again, that whole hyper-local neighborhood identity that I was just discussing goes away when we disperse our youth from their communities. And so I would like to see a plan for us to, one, repurpose the buildings that are closed into community centers and, you know, training programs. You know, I was really sad to see Gordon Elementary turned into like an alternative school where barbed wire is put on top of a school that has a historical sign out front for being one of the first to be integrated, you know, so like the juxtaposition of things like that, where I think that what could be more beneficial to the community would be, it could be like an adult career readiness training center. It could be, you know, a Secondchance center for our disconnected youth. I am really excited about the conversations we're having about whole child strategies and trauma. They sound like buzzwords of the day to a lot of people, but it is a real situation that kids are coming into the classroom with the experiences and traumas of adults, and with teachers not having the language or the tools to address that. So I would love to see more training, and I know it's something SES did this summer to talk about what it looks like to address trauma in the classroom. Teacher retention and building a teacher pipeline, Teacher retention and building the teacher pipeline in Memphis is huge for me. It should be striking to everyone that we have such large vacancies. It usually only gets reported at the beginning of the year. You know, people think, oh, we started schools with 200 vacancies, but what a lot of people don't realize is that number is usually the same in October and March.
Lots of turnover.
Lots of turnover and a lot of vacancies. And so there's a program in New York that Mayor de Blasio has been working on for a few years regarding building a male teacher pipeline. And so one reason that is important is because when we look at school disconnection, the large population of kids that aren't working nor in school are males of color, and Black males and Latinx males. And, you know, we know that when kids see themselves in roles of leadership, when they see people who look like them in those roles, their retention is much higher. One Black male teacher can change the trajectory of a Black male student's life. One Latinx male teacher can change the trajectory of a Latinx male. And so de Blasio's program focuses on recruiting and bringing male educators to New York, putting them through a fellowship and keeping them in the classroom. Yep, I work for Teach for America. One thing I'm proud of that we are able to do is we have one of the highest alumni retention rates, meaning that our alums don't just do 2 years, they do 3, 5. They go on to lead schools, they go on to become coaches at SES, they go on to become principals. And so as a commissioner, I believe that one thing we could do is with the education budget, ensure that there are avenues for teacher retention strategies, because right now I think that it's underfunded and underfocused. There's a great article that was written in Chalkbeat about the impact of having a substitute, how an entire biology class over at BTW failed their test for the year because they never had a full-time teacher. So these are all things that, you know, we can find the proof that there's an impact there that I would love to see changed. The deferred maintenance. Our kids shouldn't be in school buildings with, you know, the air conditioning dripping or no air conditioning or mold on the ceilings, you know. Like, it's, you know, when you go into schools, it doesn't. And with our kids so connected to media and social media, they know what it looks like to be in a building that's not cared for. And what that speaks to them is, my school's not cared for, my community's not cared for, I don't matter, I'm not cared for. And so while deferred maintenance is important for their safety, and the aesthetic also helps with retention of youth as well. So the deferred maintenance bill is important to me for us to figure out whether it's bringing in, more resources from building relationships with developers who can donate their time to education. We talk about tax breaks for, all kinds of things. What's it look like to say, like, hey, in addition to if you donate to this, there's a way, to make that work. But I would love to see our kids go to school in buildings that welcome them every day. And so additionally, we have one of the largest growing and fastest growing immigrant populations in the state. So we need resources for bilingual education, for ELL teachers, and for ELL teachers that are well-versed in immigration policy and topics. For example, the reason everything that's happening with immigration matters is because the outcome is that immigrant kids get pulled from classrooms when their parents get scared. And their education starts and stops. It happened in Middle Tennessee a few months ago where over 600 kids ended up not coming to school after, a raid on a plant there, because their parents were scared to send them to school. And so if we're taking responsibility for education immigrant children, we need to be aware of how to support the kids.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Just that she almost answered all the questions, but one thing, obviously, you've seen a lot of what I write, and a big focus of mine is just starting from the things that can stabilize these families, and one of those things, obviously, is jobs. You've addressed small business development, things like that. But the big problem in Memphis is that, the biggest employer here, FedEx, they don't pay, much. I mean, people are fighting just to get a living wage, to get a decent wage. But, a lot of times you say, well, how would you go about addressing that? Because a lot of these companies that come here, they get tax breaks and they don't pay a living wage and they don't pay a decent wage. As a commissioner, how would you address this whole issue of, and I'm sure you saw the report about now how minimum wage won't buy you nowhere in America, a one-bedroom apartment. How would you go about, because you need that to even begin to stabilize and stay in one place and educate your kids.
Absolutely.
A lot of temporary workers in Memphis too.
Oh yeah. Not to mention, we number 3 in the country, number 5, top 5 temp towns. We're temp town.
Yeah. So, one thing is, with everything that the Edge Board is doing, there has to be a conversation about what agreements we make and how those agreements include what pay should be paid. And I just think that we allow too much temporary work when we make agreements and companies come into Memphis. I think that our largest employers could definitely reevaluate their pay scale, evaluate the temp structure. That's not something we can make them do, but that is something that we can continue to have conversations around through the EDGE program. I am not in agreement of giving, pilots or bonuses or agreements to anybody who's not willing to pay a living wage or who comes with a pay structure that includes more temp workers than permanent workers. And I also think this ties into transportation once again. Shelby County has to get in the transportation conversation and support MATA. It is the biggest connector of the county. And one of the things that's keeping us from being a more competitive city is the fact that there's not a way to get around. We have such a vastly spread out county, and there's not a way to get to all the resources you need. So people in Fraser can't work at the FedEx Technology Center. It'll take them 2 hours to get there, and I don't know if the bus even goes all the way out there.
Well, we got a guy recently.
And we need to get employers to buy into, what it would look like for them to be able to use, for them to encourage employees to use our public transportation as well. And so, additionally, I just think that we can't continue to, award contracts and agreements to people who have more temp workers than they have permanent jobs, because it's only hurting and keeping, our economic system destabilized.
As you've campaigned, both the primary as well as now, What have you learned from going around the district talking to residents and others about yourself?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I talk about this a lot, is that I just have had a lot of opportunity and privilege. And that even being able to run for office and ask people to choose me as a leader, I realized, like, when I talked about coming home and not feeling like Choose 901, what it meant for me, how disconnected we are as a community. How, you know, we talk about the tale of two Memphises, and it's really the tale of 5 or 6, you know, and especially once you think of Shelby County as at large. And so what I've really learned about myself is that, you know, there's I don't know if it's a Bible verse or if it's just an old saying, but to whom much is given, you know, much is required. And that this is a privilege to do this work. It's a privilege to run for office. And that there's a duty that I think people are, you know, giving me. Like, you're coming to my door, you're asking to my vote. I'm giving you the duty to listen to me. I am asking you not to just take this office and disappear and come back in 4 years and ask me, you know, for your vote again. And so the one thing that I've definitely been committing to is how do we communicate with the members of the residents of District 7? How do we set up not just mail newsletters or email newsletters, but monthly town halls across District 7 in different parts of the community? Thinking again back to that transportation access. I can't ask everybody to come to, you know, Valentine and Evergreen. I can't ask everybody to come to New Chicago. I've got to meet the people where they are. Another thing that I've learned is that I have to be flexible. You know, everyone's concerns are not the same. I can name the top 3 or 5, but, you know, every other door, every other, you know, event is showing me how deeply layered the need for change is in Shelby County, and that I still have a lot to learn and a lot of listening to do.
What got you into this idea of being a public servant? Why are you so concerned about what's happening in your community, and why do you want to be so engaged in that effort? Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in a family that my parents were kids of the 70s, so, you know, I was reading Stokely Carmichael and, you know, Angela Davis, like, at 11 and 12. So I've always been a community-oriented person. I, you know, interned with Girls Inc. and at the Children's Museum as a, you know, teenager and a college student, and I've always been, you know, a part of, like, volunteering. But the older I got and the more that I was studying and reading about the way that policy impacts systems, policy impacts inequity, the more I felt that it was my duty to do more than just volunteer. In serving the public, for me, the outcome of even incremental bits of change, the fact that we can see that happen, the fact that we can change conversations, the fact that we can have discussions that we weren't having 3 years ago, 5 years ago, and find that opening up doors and opportunity, that's why I do that work. Someone said to me last week, there's no such thing as a voiceless people, there are unheard people. And so when I talk about my privilege, I think that it's my, it's a requirement of the educational opportunities that I had. When I know that, you know, in 2030 there will be no wealth in the Black community if things continue as is. And so I'm not, you know, if you put it in my mother's voice, she says, you just, you know, we're only a generation or two out of the hood. We're only a generation or two out of poverty. And, you know, the amount of studies that have been showed that the average middle-class Black person is just one life accident away from being back into poverty means that this is not something we can turn our back on, or work we can't do. And that doesn't just impact, you know, African Americans, it impacts Latino Americans, and we just have to figure out a way that economics are not continuously based on race. And we haven't solved that yet, and that's why I do this work.
Tami, could you clarify a couple of points? One is, did I hear you say you'd like to see pilots tied to school donations?
Not necessarily. No, what I was saying was that I think that I was saying we have pilots, we have TIFs, we have programs like EDGE, and I wonder what it would be like. I don't know, but I wonder what it would be like for us to have a program where like developers could donate maintenance upgrades, you know, to schools, and there's some type of, I don't know if it's a tax break, I don't know if it's points or what, and I believe it's been done elsewhere, but it would greatly reduce the deferred maintenance bill if we could find a way to get donors engaged. I mean, not donors, but developers engaged, and you know, even small businesses, you know, when you make bids on county projects, like if you make a bid and throw in there, I'll work on a school, you might win the bid. Like, what does that look like? I don't know the legality around that, but that's something I would love to research to see how we can include in our contract and bidding process donation of services to repair schools as well.
And you talked about funding for micro-level development in neighborhoods. Where would the money come from for that funding, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way to look at the current budget and see if there's room for it. You know, I've been reading the FY19 budget, and, you know, I think that there's programs that could fall under. But one thing is that I don't know if you all saw that that banks have now been approved to give small loans to at-risk individuals, second chance loans, and they're doing it at a rate and a level that will hopefully defeat predatory lending in most states. So, for example, what SunTrust is doing over at Crosstown, where it's community oriented, it's helping people repair their credit, it's helping them do small business programming. There's micro lending happening over in Orange Mile with Rashawn Austin, and so I think that the banking community and nonprofit organizations could fund some of that, and I think there's federal grants that are available as well. I think a lot of this opportunity, like I'm not making these like terms up. I think there's a way to bring them into Memphis and see them flourish.
And also, could you reconcile this? You mentioned that when you came back as a millennial, you had great hopes, and yet you could not easily find a job. And yet you did find work with the school board and the Teach for America. Reconcile that idea. So you found work, but what? It was hard to find a decent job?
Yeah, it was hard to find a good job. It was hard to find a job that was on the same level of work that I was doing, you know, before, income-wise, you know, level-wise. I left DC as a director, making a certain salary, you know, and I came home and I was like, you know, and it took 9-10 months almost, you know, of a job search for me to find a permanent position. And so that was, you know, quite frustrating because in DC, like, I never had a problem finding a job.
And why do you think, you saw this level of apathy here, why do you think it exists in Memphis?
I think the apathy is tied to still just a continuous lack of, you know, a continuous lack of opportunity and us really getting deep into neighborhood levels. I think that our communities outside of, you know, Midtown, downtown are really disconnected from the economic vein of the city, the opportunity vein of the city. You know, schools have been closed in communities, businesses have been closed. There was a article done in High Ground News where they took pictures of all of the, like, these beautiful buildings that once were booming business centers and are now just empty and closed, and what they mean to those communities. And I think that apathy decreases when people see more people caring about their neighborhoods and their, that they feel withdrawn from the center. I mean, you can go into some schools and there's kids who know the Grizzlies but couldn't tell you how to get downtown to watch them play. Or they've never been to the Pyramid. They don't know what Bass Pro is. And those are things that a lot of us just, take for granted. Like, oh, I'm going to FedEx, or I'm going, to Rail Garden, or, I'm going to go hang out in Midtown. And, we've got kids who've never left Fraser, who've never left Raleigh. And so, like, when I talk about that tale of multiple cities, it shouldn't be so hard for us to connect all of our communities together and to provide thoroughfares where I can get to a job in Midtown and work and bring that money back home to my community and save some money and then open a business that I just got trained in Midtown in Raleigh, right? But we don't have like this symbiotic relationship between our communities that I think would help us. And I think that causes the apathy because people just don't see the business center, the political center, caring about their communities. When we knock on doors, they say to us, you're one of the first people to come in 4 years. Or, there's an election every year, and very rarely. I mean, we get votes because people say, like, I will vote for you because y'all came by. So, like, they don't feel heard. They don't feel seen. And I think that's what increases apathy. We can yell at people, people died for you to vote. Think about the civil rights movement. And they can respond with, and what's happened since then? 50 years, 47% of black kids still live below the line of poverty, right? And so they haven't seen any change, and they disengage, and then that gets passed down from generation to generation. I grew up going to vote with my parents, right? Like, press the button, Tam, with my dad. Like, that was a ritual. And my nieces go vote with their parents. Like, that's something that, we were taught. But if that apathy gets passed down, if that like lack of engagement in the political process gets passed down, if I hadn't seen my parents vote, I wouldn't have known it was important. I wouldn't have known what politics can and cannot change in our communities. And I just think that we have generational apathy that we have to impact, but we have to show up for people in a different way.
Final question.
Off the wall question. Is there a story behind the tattoo on your wrist?
I went to Africa and I loved it. And I just, spent a lot of time connecting with like the story of the African diaspora and what it means to me. And it's really important to me to just remind myself and be grounded in who I am, and even though I'll never know the names of my ancestors, I'll never know, what village we came from, unless I do, 23andMe, like might get us close. It just grounds me in the work.
Ghana?
Kenya.
Okay.
And then I also went to Cuba, and that just really, for me, all of that grounded me in the African diaspora and the importance. And, just back to education, I think that a lot of kids, African American kids, do not have, their identity is tied to their self-esteem, and they don't know their history. They don't know that, yes, there was slavery, but that there's also a lot to be proud of. And I don't think that our kids are given enough reasons to be proud and believe they can succeed.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you.